So I have this really creepy, eerie memory of being home alone when I was a little kid. My recollection of it is super dreamlike, to the point that I actually thought that it was a dream for most of my adult life. But then recently my mom mentioned the incident and I sort of said, huh, wait, that actually happened? And then she says, yeah. And that's when I realized that I have a true scary story to share with you and not some lame dream, and I think I preferred it when I thought that it was a dream though. And so I remember waking up in the middle of the night and everything felt heavy and still. You know when you can just tell that your house is empty even though there's no reason to know that? That's how this felt. But I was like 4 years old and it was the middle of the night, so that it was all pretty alarming to me. I wandered out of my room and into my parents' room. I was too short to reach any light switches, so I had to make do with the moonlight and what little light there was. I could see that my parents' bed was empty, so I went downstairs looking for them. In the living room, the TV was on, playing nothing but static, and I have no idea what time of the night this was or why any station would be showing only static, but that's what I remember, and I also remember weird red lights flickering throughout the memory. And the next, I went into the kitchen, trying to find any trace of my parents. At first, I didn't notice her sitting there in the darkness. An old woman, and when she spoke, it made me jump. I tried to reach the light switch because there was a stool in the kitchen that I could climb onto to turn it on. However, the old lady told me not to turn on the light, so I didn't. I could just about see her outlined by the moonlight sitting at the kitchen table, and the weirdest part is to this day, I would swear that she was completely, totally naked. Why this didn't alarm me as a little kid, I don't know, but I just sort of accepted it at the time. She explained to me that she was the neighbor and my parents had sent her here to look after me. She said that mommy and daddy had to go away, but she was here now and she'd always be here. And before I even had a chance to fully take in her words, I heard the sound of the front door being unlocked and opening. Immediately, I ran out into the hallway and saw my parents entering the house. They quickly turned the lights on and Mom gathered me up in her arms and hugged me and said that they were sorry for leaving me alone. I told them it was okay. The neighbor lady had come to look after me and said that she'd always be here. And when they asked me where the lady was, I explained that she was in the kitchen. And the next thing I remember is being in the kitchen, my dad turning on the light, and the chair where the old lady had been sitting was on the floor and the back door was wide open. When Mom referenced the event recently, I asked her if she could remember any further details than what I'd just shared. Mom shed some more light onto it, and they'd both gone outside into the front yard because there had been a house fire nearby in the neighborhood. And like a bunch of the neighbors, they went outside to check out what was going on when they were woken by the red lights of the fire service and paramedics. And that explains why the memory is just sort of tinted for red for me, I guess. According to Mom, I told them that the neighbor lady had come to take me away, not to take care of me. I'd also told them that she wasn't wearing any clothes and that I didn't like her, so I was glad that they had come home when they did. And from the way Mom remembers it, the old lady was on the verge of leaving with me. She says that they kept asking me about it gently without wanting to scare me, and I described an extremely old, naked woman who had been waiting in the kitchen and tried to persuade me to go with her. Another weird detail is that as a little kid, I repeatedly described the woman as slimy or being covered in slime, but could never explain what I meant by that. Mom says that they found a jar of some condiment on the table with an unknown clear substance on it, which weirdly verifies my claim that the lady was slimy. And this was a new detail for me too. I don't even remember the slime, but it's definitely not something that my elderly mother would have added herself. My mom says they were only gone from the house for 5 minutes or so, and that they always wondered whether the neighborhood fire and the naked, slimy old lady were connected. Maybe the substance that she was covered in was some kind of accelerant, and that'd be my guess. It's good to know that I didn't just dream about some creepy old naked woman when I was a little kid, but on the other hand, knowing that the memory is real doesn't make me feel very safe whenever I'm home alone, even all the way now, well into my 30s. So I have a story for you that's become a bit of a legend in my family. It's a weirdly fond memory, even though it was absolutely terrifying at the time, and I think you'll understand why I appreciate the memory even then. Back in the days when this happened, my dad was a park ranger out on a range near Beacon Rock. He and Mom had separated shortly after I was born, and our relationship had always been a bit strained. And I don't want to imply that Dad was absent or anything like that. He just wasn't the type who intended to settle down and have a family, and it was clearly a big adjustment for him. Which meant that when he did try, he tried his best, but he wasn't present all the time, and sometimes I'd go months without hearing from him. As I grew older, I knew not to take this personally. Dad was what they called a wandering soul. He needed to be out in nature to feel alive, and it was genuinely his calling to be a park ranger and care for others out in the wilderness, that is, the United States nature. And as a boy growing up, there were plenty of times when I was mad at my father for not being around as much as other dads, or having a place that I could easily visit every other weekend. And then as I grew up and became a man, I started to really respect and relate to him, especially after he passed. I have a lot of fond memories and wild stories about Dad, especially from when I was older, but this is one of the rare stories when I was younger, and it's a story about Dad where he's notable for not being around. Now let me explain. Dad was the kind of ranger who moved around between different parks, but after he fathered me, he tried to find a more permanent spot and became the ranger up near Beacon Rock. He had a small but tidy cabin up there, which meant that he finally had somewhere that I could safely visit and stay, especially now that I turned 10. I was at a stage in my life where I'd gotten over being a bratty kid, but I wasn't quite a too cool for school teenager, so that summer my dad was my hero. We did so much cool stuff together: fishing, animal spotting, hiking, and exploring around Beacon Rock. Like any hot-blooded ranger's son, I was absolutely fascinated by the Bigfoot legends around the area. Dad would roll his eyes and indulge me whenever I'd ask him to tell me about the big old mountain men, and women I assume, who were rumored to live and hunt in the area. Dad always preferred talking about other, more tangibly real animals, but I always wanted to hear about Bigfoots. I mean, who wouldn't? They're genuinely a fascinating cryptid, whether you believe they exist or not. But as for me, well, listen to my story and then decide which camp you think I fall into. Now, it was late evening when Dad got the call. A search and rescue operation was underway some ways down the park, and they absolutely needed all hands on deck. Dad argued, swore, and insisted that he wasn't happy leaving his son back at the cabin, and we had movie night planned. But then he sat me down and we talked about it, and he explained how this job meant that sometimes people's lives were in his hands, and I was absolutely fine with him going and being a hero. And besides, I had my Wii at the cabin, and I was happy to get in a bit of practice so I could kick Dad's ass at Wii Sports Resort all that weekend. And so Dad drove off down the trail in his Jeep, and I just settled in for a late night of video games and worrying about my dad's safety. Now, I tired myself out on Wii Sports Resort and then just settled to play some Zelda. The sun had set outside now, and I thought about whoever was missing in the park and hoped that Dad and the other rangers would be able to find them safely. And when I first heard creaking and movement on the porch outside, I assumed Dad was back and readied myself to greet him. The cabin was open plan so I could see the front door from the living room, and that's when I realized that whoever was in the porch was not Dad. They were lurking around out there doing something, but not unlocking the door or coming inside. And then my heart sank as I heard the door rattling. Someone was trying to open it, and it definitely wasn't my father because he had a key. I got up off the couch and crept towards the door, hoping that I could peer through the window and see something in the darkness. And as soon as I got close to the door, the rattling stopped, almost respectfully so. And I sniffed. There was a certain scent, strong and impossible to ignore, and my eyes just lit up. Could it really be? It smelled like a wet dog, musky and damp, exactly like Dad had described in his stories. Bigfoot. If it was actually Bigfoot out there, then I knew that I'd be completely foolish to open the door and introduce myself to some 8 or 9 foot cryptid muscle man. So thankfully, I kept my cool and just simply stood near the door smelling that musky animal smell. And there was some taps on the door, like 1, 2, 3 taps, almost like a signal or a greeting. Now, I would have been wowed by this, but then something on the other side of the cabin immediately drew my attention. Another sound, this time the splintering of wood. A much more aggressive, threatening sound. It was coming from the room at the back. A thin corridor sort of room, which meant that I could hear where the sound was coming from, but couldn't see what was causing it. Torn between a potential Bigfoot sighting and a potential intruder, I rushed to the door leading into the back room and looked around the doorframe. And sure enough, at the window was a very human-sized figure, clearly trying to finagle the window open with some kind of tool, which had splintered the wood and was even now letting the intruders slide their fingers into the gap and start to open the window. I gasped in terror, and the figure must have heard me because he resumed his attempts to open the window, and without thinking, I shouted out for help. The response was an angry roar from the other side of the cabin, then the thundering sound of distant footsteps. Suddenly, the figure at the window froze and immediately withdrew from trying to break in and disappeared. I ran to the window and could see just the faint movement of shadows outside in the moonlight. It was an incredibly dark night, and we left the back porch lights off while I was alone, precisely to avoid drawing the attention of any would-be criminals, I assume. I kept watching, and I'm absolutely sure of this. I saw a second, much larger shadow come running from around the side of the cabin and run past the glass as I hastily closed and relocked the window, which thankfully I was able to do despite the damage to the frame. I guess it hadn't been closed properly in the first place, which is how the intruder had managed to get it partially open. And I could hear running footsteps leading away from the cabin, and they sounded way too heavy to be any sort of man. It was all a bit chaotic and terrifying though, and I'm not ashamed to say that I shut off all the lights, grabbed some pillows, and hid under the table in the living room for a while. Eventually, I guess I drifted off to sleep, but something woke me up. In the still darkness, I could smell it again. That scent of disgusting, wet, musky dog. It was coming from the direction of the front door, and in my half-asleep state, the smell made me feel comforted in a weird way, even though it was so pungent. Like I knew that I was safe now. And then I somehow managed to drift off back to sleep, tired from fear and the events of the night. Eventually, I woke up again at what turned out to be about 7 a.m. Dad was just letting himself into the front door, and he was surprised to see me crawl out from under the table. He was holding something in his hand, though, and looking between this thing and me in surprise, and I looked at it too. And I asked him what he had, and he held it up and said that he'd found this on the doorstep when he got back. It was sort of a rock and a feather, and he said that they'd been placed squarely in the front of the door, with a rock on top of the feather, and definitely had not been there when he'd left the night before. So then I explained the events of the night to him as we sat at the table, both just staring at the offerings left on our doorstep. So what had been going on with Dad while I had my adventures, you're probably asking? Well, it turns out that the search and rescue was actually a hiking disagreement turned nasty. 2 hikers had a disagreement, and one of them shoved the other down a small cliff and disappeared off into the forest. And this had been observed by other hikers from some distance away, purely by chance, so the rangers had to locate the assault victim and also aid in trying to capture his assailant. We were convinced that this person is the guy who tried to break into the back window of the cabin. And after assaulting his buddy, he made his way through the forest and found Dad's cabin and decided that he had to break in. Whether he knew that there was a kid in the cabin or not, we don't actually know. Probably not. It was clearly a marked ranger's cabin, so he likely assumed the ranger was out helping with the search and rescue or just off doing something else. As for the other visitor, well, who can say? But someone or something chased off that intruder that night, and they smelled like a wet dog and left an offering of a rock and a feather on my doorstep as if to say, "Hey, I'm looking out for you, buddy. I got your back." Sure, it could have been a normal animal that spooked the assailant. The guy disappeared off into the wilderness, and as far as Dad was able to ever track, he never got caught. so we were never able to interrogate him as to whether he'd been chased off by a Bigfoot. But I know what I believe, and I was there that night. I heard those footsteps and smelled that musk, and I was the one whose life was saved by the most unlikely of saviors. I believe, and Dad believed too, and we never had any encounters quite as close to that, but there was certainly other evidence that Bigfoots are more than just a myth in the area. As to whether you believe or not, I'll leave that entirely up to you. As a kid, I grew up in foster care, so I have a lot of memories of being home alone. These were mostly from early homes that I stayed in as a little kid, and there's only one that stands out as being really terrifying, but it ended up changing my life. Thankfully, it changed it for the better, but at the time, it felt like it could be the end of everything. As a former foster care kid, I just want to say, please only take up fostering for the right reasons. There are so many kids in the system whose stories don't have a happy ending like mine does, and I wish that wasn't the case. I've been placed with this family, the Harrisons, for about 3 weeks when this happened. I was coming off another stint in the group home, so at first I was excited to be with my family again. But when I met with the Harrisons, it was pretty quickly clear that they didn't care about me at all. I was just an excuse to get an extra paycheck from the government. And thankfully, they weren't an abusive couple. They were just negligent, which I'd take over being actively abusive any day, but it sucks that we have to accept either. The Harrisons were actually nice to me in the way they acted. They weren't especially mean or cruel, and they were pretty generous with letting me help myself to snacks or treats from the kitchen. And I was an extremely shy and quiet 6-year-old girl who mostly just liked to hide under her bed and read, so I guess I was the perfect kid for a couple like this. You see, they wanted a kid that they could foster who would just stay quiet and stay in the house while they went out and went about their lives. And that was me, all right. I never got in trouble, or stood up for myself, or did anything defiant, really, at least not when I was a little kid. So after a couple of days, the Harrisons took to leaving me alone in the house almost every evening. And honestly, this was fine by me. I was a very self-sufficient 6-year-old. I had to be, growing up in care, and at the time I thought this was just bliss, being trusted to just sort of house-sit alone, free to access as many snacks as I wanted, and all I had to worry about was making sure that I didn't get in any trouble. Sometimes I wonder how long I would have stayed with the Harrisons, being poorly and negligently non-parented, if the following event hadn't happened. And as I said, I'd been there for a few weeks, and it was yet another night where I was left on my own. I was just watching TV in the living room when there was a knock at the door. The house was in a sort of run-down suburb, better than what I was used to, but definitely a bit sketchy looking back. But to me it was a palace, and the fact that the Harrisons felt comfortable leaving me alone all night made me assume that it must be safe. Even so, I still knew not to answer the door when I was home alone. Mr. Harrison repeated this to me every single time they went out all evening and left me there. Don't cause any damage, don't answer the door, don't forget to brush your teeth before bed. Always those 3 things. There'd never been a knock at the door before when I was home alone, so even though I had no intention of answering, I crept into the hallway just to listen. And I remembered that there was no way for anyone on the front porch to see inside and see me, so I felt emboldened by that. I guess the guy outside heard the floorboards creak or something, though, because he was able to tell when I stepped into the hallway. He called out to me, and his voice was kind and gentle, and I wondered if maybe it wasn't anything to worry about. He said he was from CPS, and that he was there to check on me and see if everything was going okay at my new foster home. I didn't reply because I knew the Harrisons would be in trouble if the CPS found out they left me alone at night, and I really wanted to stay in this home where I was basically ignored and left to my own devices to read and watch cartoons. The guy outside kept talking and saying that he knew that I was in there, and that I should just open the door and let him in so he could check if everything was fine. And so I crept over to the other side of the hallway, by the stairs, and sat down on the steps. Then the guy said that he'd left something behind when he visited before and that the Harrisons would want me to let him in, and in fact they told him to tell me to let him in. He used their full names too, which made me start doubting myself. I finally asked him to repeat who he was, and this time he said he was a friend of the family, and that the Harrisons had asked him to drop by to check if I was okay. Now, I may have been 6 years old and quiet, but I wasn't stupid. This guy had claimed that he was from CPS, and now he was saying he was a friend of the family. So I quietly said that I couldn't let him in because the Harrisons had told me not to ever answer the door for strangers. At first, the guy told me this was good, and I was a good girl for listening, and he said they'd wanted to test that I was sensible and could be trusted. And then he started insisting that now they'd done the test, I could let him in so he could quickly grab his wallet that he'd left behind. Now, I replied saying that I was very sorry, but I wasn't able to do that. This was a mistake. It caused the guy to explode with rage. It was so sudden and terrifying that I can still remember the exact sound of him suddenly punching or hitting the front door. I can remember the explosion of anger and the horrible things he yelled at me through the door. Things I can't even repeat in the story, as well as calling me a brat, a bad child, a horrible little C word, etc. Obviously, this really upset and scared me, and my go-to response to being scared was to find the nearest closet and hide in it. Fortunately, I had a closet in my room at the Harrisons, so I ran upstairs and hid in there. Less fortunately, the location of my room meant that I could still hear the guy at the front door. He was bashing and shouting, hurling all sorts of upsetting insults at me. And this went on for what felt like hours. Maybe it even was. At one point, it sounded like he was trying to pick the lock or do something to break in. And I sat there in the closet, shivering and crying as this man that I didn't know and had never seen made the most vile threats. I had no idea if or when he might get inside, and if he did, then surely it would only be a matter of time before he found me. Eventually, I heard another voice besides his, and then another, and it sounded like the Harrisons. And then there was some angry screaming and some loud bangs from outside, not gunshot type of bangs, but like almost wood hitting wood or something being smashed. I started crying harder, terrified that something awful was happening to the Harrisons. And when I heard the front door eventually open, it was accompanied by a sudden silence and calm. And then it slammed shut, and relief washed over me as I heard Mrs. Harrison calling out for me, asking where I was. I stayed in the closet for a while, too scared to reply or speak, and the Harrisons both called to me. Not kindly, though, but not angrily either, just sounding like it was all too annoying to deal with. And eventually, Mr. Harrison found me in the closet and told me to come out, that everything was fine now. I was too terrified to even ask them anything about the incident, and for their part, they certainly weren't offering any information. Instead, Mr. Harrison seemed almost angry with me, and that scared me even more, so I didn't want to push and ask for any further information, even though secretly I was just dying to know who the man was and what had happened with him. And the next day, Mr. Harrison was gone when I woke up, and only Mrs. Harrison was at home. She made me breakfast and didn't make any comment on the night's events at all, nor did she tell me what was about to happen. When the knock at the door came, I was surprised to see it was one of my caseworkers from CPS, who was there to take me back to the group home, apparently. No explanation was given, and Mrs. Harrison wouldn't even look me in the eye when she said goodbye, and that she wished me luck with the rest of my life. Now, I was too shy and scared to even ask why I was being returned to the group home, but as my caseworker gave me a ride back, I mentioned something about how a man had come to the Harrisons' house the night before, and she said, "I know, sweetie," and just ruffled my hair, so I knew that whatever was leading me to be removed from the Harrisons' house, it involved that man. And to this day, I have no idea who he was or how or why CPS found out about it and removed me from that family. I never saw the Harrisons again, and I could never find anything about them when I tried looking them up online years later, just out of curiosity. I spent a few more months in that group home until I was eventually fostered by a family who ultimately adopted me, and who I now consider to be my real family. Like I said at the start, most children in the foster care system aren't as lucky as me. Some of them end up face to face with a man like the one who threatened me through the door and aren't lucky enough to be removed from their terrible situation. Years later, a tiny part of me is still desperately wanting to know who that man was and what he had planned for me, but a much bigger part of me can probably guess what kind of man he was, and that part of me is grateful that I'll never have to know. So when I was a kid, it became a tradition for a few of us cousins to stay with Grandma over summer vacation. Grandma was my mom's mom, and there were 4 of us cousins on Mom's side, although I had 6 maternal cousins in total. We'd cross over into each other's lives every summer through Grandma, and it became a summer event that I always looked forward to. Sometimes one of us would be staying at Grandma's alone, depending on the timing of things and what one family might be doing or what summer vacations they might be taking. This summer, there was a period of 5 days when I found myself staying alone with Grandma. Now, this hadn't been planned. Usually, these summer vacations with Grandma were designed for us cousins to hang out. This one week, the plan had been for my cousins Saffron and Bryant to be here too, but due to some mistake or other to do with hotel bookings, they were arriving later. I didn't mind hanging out with Grandma for a few days by myself. We always had fun there, whether there were other cousins present or not, but this does all explain why, on one night that week, I was left alone in Grandma's house while she went to her usual weekly bingo. Normally, Grandma tried to avoid leaving any of us home alone by ourselves, but this time I assured her that it would be absolutely fine. I was 12 now, practically a man, and I could just chill and watch television or play on my Nintendo DS while she went out to bingo. Now, she'd only be gone for 4 or 5 hours. What could go wrong in that time? A lot, it turns out, and the events that played out were enough to shatter my trust in other people for years to come. Grandma had been gone for about half an hour at that point, and I was playing video games, so it felt like 5 minutes. Grandma walked into town for the bingo, as she'd given up driving a few years before. So when the doorbell rang, I didn't think anything of answering it, assuming Grandma had forgotten her keys because I wasn't really aware that any time had passed since she left. And when I pulled open the door with a smile ready for Grandma, and I saw the young woman on the doorstep, I suddenly remembered that I wasn't supposed to answer the door to strangers when I was home alone. If only I'd thought about that before pulling the door open enthusiastically. But I had done so, and the young woman on the doorstep immediately stepped into the house and gave me a small hug and then closed the door behind her. And I was kind of like, "Hey, who are you?" A bit taken aback and shocked by this cool-looking girl hugging me and pushing her way into Grandma's house, all familiar and friendly. And the girl acted sort of mock-upset and told me that she was horrified that I didn't remember her. She was Alice, my cousin, Uncle Jim's daughter, Martin's sister. And it suddenly clicked. Martin was the other cousin who'd often stay at Grandma's house, and there was me, and then Saffron and Bryant, who were Aunt Yvette's kids, and Martin, who was Uncle Jim's son. But Martin had 2 older siblings too, who were too old to come stay at Grandma's with us. One of them, Fred, was quite a bit older and had a kid himself, and we saw him at family events, but I'd completely forgotten about Alice. I couldn't remember the last time that I'd seen my cousin Alice, but now I could definitely tell it was her. She'd gotten taller and older and more emo-looking in the few years since I'd seen her last, and I tried to remember how old she'd had to have been now, 18 or 19 maybe. Alice walked into Grandma's living room and dumped a full-looking duffel bag on the couch, and she began looking around as if almost looking for Grandma, and I explained that Grandma was out at bingo and wouldn't be back until later. Alice acted all bummed out and that she'd missed Grandma, but said that she was going to be staying overnight, so it was fine, and she'd catch Grandma when she got back. And there was absolutely nothing that made me feel like I shouldn't trust Alice. Heck, there were even photographs on the wall of her in the living room. Even if she looked a bit different in ways that I couldn't quite put my finger on, this was definitely my cousin Alice. She started asking me about Mom and how we were doing, and it confused me a bit because she didn't seem to know that Mom and Dad had gotten divorced a couple of years ago. But then she made such a big show of apologizing about it and acting like she felt bad for forgetting. No reason why she should remember anyway. I'd barely even remembered who she was. And after about an hour or so of hanging out with Alice, she asked me if I remembered when we used to play hide and seek in Grandma's house when I was a little kid. I did vaguely remember, and Granddad had been alive back then, and Grandma's big house seemed even bigger when I was a little kid. Now, I was worried that Alice was going to ask me to play hide and seek with her again, which seemed distinctly uncool as a 12-year-old. And instead, she asked if I remembered the time that she hid in the basement and none of us could find her for hours. I said I didn't remember this because I honestly didn't. And Alice told me that back in those days, all of us kids had been terrified of the basement except for her, and she was the only one brave enough to go down there and hide. I laughed and said that Grandma's basement didn't scare me at all anymore now, and I didn't remember being scared of it as a kid. Alice laughed and said that I'd been so scared of the basement that I'd cried when the door was left open. I didn't remember this at all, and I just laughed it off. And then Alice said that she dared me to go down there. I think I just shrugged and just asked why or something, and she really played it up about how scared of the basement all of us cousins used to be. And then she dared me $10 to go down into the basement to prove that I wasn't scared of it anymore. Now please remember at this point, no matter how much of an obviously suspicious red flag this seems, A, I was 12 years old, and B, I had no reason to distrust my slightly older cousin even if she had shown up unexpectedly at Grandma's house. All I had were good, somewhat hazy memories of hanging out with Alice when we were younger, and I had no reason to read anything deeper into it. I thought my cousin was just being goofy and I'd forgotten the lore of the basement. I also really wanted $10, and Grandma's basement wasn't even slightly spooky. It was just a normal food storage basement, and going down there was an easy $10. I only realized how badly I'd screwed up when I got to the bottom, and the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the sound of a key clunking in the lock. I still thought Alice was pranking me, even when more and more time passed and I was trapped down there with no way out. I didn't entertain the idea that anything too bad was going on, though. When hour 2 crept up, though, and then hour 3 and hour 4, I knew something was very wrong. I was busting for a pee, and my throat was hoarse from screaming for help and calling for Alice or Grandma or anyone. And I would never admit this at the time, but now in adulthood I'm fine with admitting that I cried so much at that point that I had a headache and spent the entire time that I was trapped in the basement begging and pleading with Alice to let me out. It felt like I'd been down there for 100 years when I eventually heard the sound of the door being unlocked and Grandma's voice calling down to me. She sounded old, frail, and panicked. I rushed up the basement stairs and hugged Grandma and collapsed sobbing onto the living room couch. Grandma asked me what had happened, and eventually I just snorted out the explanation that Cousin Alice had come over, I'd let her in, and she'd locked me in the basement. Grandma's hand flew over her mouth, and she just kept asking me over and over if I was definitely sure it was Alice, as in our cousin Alice, Uncle Jim's daughter. I said yes. I was pretty sure that's who she said she was, but why had she locked me in the basement, though? Now, at first, Grandma didn't know, but then she went to check something, and when she came back, I could see that she was white and shaking. To this day, I still don't know exactly what Alice stole from Grandma. She took that secret to her grave, and it led to some very heated exchanges between the families because presumably whatever it was held some significant value and would have been an important part of the inheritance when Grandma passed. I managed to piece together some of the story over the years, though. Alice had been estranged from Uncle Jim and Aunt Leslie since she was 15 or 16. She'd fallen in with a bad crowd and developed some extremely bad habits, and, well, you can probably guess the rest. Grandma and the other adults hid it from us that our cousin Alice had become wayward, and this meant that I wasn't prepared when she showed up at Grandma's house that night. The theory is that she had been watching the place and knew that I was alone there and that she'd be able to get in by just gaining my trust. The funny thing is, I'm very grateful that she locked me in the basement. The reason is because of an item that Alice left behind in Grandma's living room. I only heard about this from cousin Martin, Alice's brother, many years later, as apparently Grandma had never been able to explain why Alice had left a hammer on the cabinet, which she must have brought with her. Martin had his theory when he told me about this some years later, though. He thinks that Alice was going to crack me in the head with that hammer if her plan had failed, and she hadn't been able to get me into the basement. I have no idea if this is true, and none of the family have ever heard from Alice again. And as far as I know, she's still out there, living off of whatever she stole from Grandma all those years ago. Grandma passed away a few years ago now, and for the last part of her life, Alice became a sort of family secret that nobody directly referenced. Kind of a sad way for a person's life to play out when you think about it. For me, it also represents the end of childhood and the end of summer vacation at Grandma's. But at least all I had to endure was a few hours locked in a brightly lit basement and not a hammer to my skull. To set the scene, I'm a female, and this happened when I was in my late teens. It was around 2008 when this happened. I was still in high school, and my parents attended some kind of charity event. This meant that they were both out together that night. And the night passed without any major incidents to start with, but then after an hour or so of being home alone, I started to receive the calls. Caller IDs said that they were coming from a blocked number, of course, and I'm not really sure why I even answered the first one because of this. I should have just ignored it, but I guess I was kind of just curious, or maybe I didn't notice the lack of caller ID because I picked up all very cheery and said, "Hello, this is," and I said my parents' residence, "How can I help you?" Something like that. I forget the exact order of the calls because they all stand out in my memory as terrifying, but the first few calls involved the caller who had a deep and robotic-sounding voice describing what I was wearing, and then what I was doing in the downstairs living room and in the kitchen. It sounded like something out of Scream, but there was something a lot more mundane and seedy about it when it was happening in real life. Just this creepy dude with some voice modulator making it extremely clear that he could see me. It's thrilling and scary in certain ways in the movies, but when it's happening to you, it really does not feel good. It made me feel dirty and intruded upon, and I guess that's why I acted irrationally. I would scream at him to leave me alone and then hang up the phone, only to answer each time he called back. I know it sounds dumb. I could have just let the phone ring off, but consider what was going through my head at the time. There was a guy who was prank calling me who could somehow see me, and I wanted to know how much danger I was truly in. As he called me, I darted around the house, closing the blinds and making sure the windows and doors were locked. At this point, I didn't consider calling the cops because the guy hadn't actually threatened me. He was just stating that he could see me and stating what I was doing. It was incredibly strange. It wasn't like some dirty voice breathing or anything like that. He'd just call and say, "You're wearing a white t-shirt, and I see you just changed the channel." Things like that. And I was worried about wasting the cops' time if I reported it, which I guess looking back is kind of stupid of me. And to this day, though, I'm not convinced that they would have taken me seriously back then. And so I got stuck in this sort of loop of every time the phone beeped, I'd feel this sick dread in my stomach, but I couldn't stop myself from answering it either. And the more I let him speak, the more I started to deduce from the things this guy was saying. He could only see me on the first floor. If I went upstairs, he lost sight of me and would hang up the phone. If I'd wanted to avoid being seen, I could have stayed upstairs and maybe I would have thought to call the cops. But I got it in my head that I should try baiting the guy, so I had something more concrete to go on. Now, in adulthood, I know that it was very stupid of me to let this play out, and I should have handled it totally differently. I was just sort of bullheaded and fiery as a kid, and I was affronted that this guy was creeping on me, and I guess, yeah, even despite how uncomfortable it was making me feel, there was a degree of childish intrigue in letting the events play out here. And eventually I had all the curtains and blinds closed downstairs, and I was confident there was absolutely no way this guy could be looking through the window of my house. Yet the calls kept coming. The phone would sound, and this guy would state matter-of-factly what was going on. I was changing the channel on the TV, and I was getting a glass of water. Very weird and mundane things to be creeped on about. And I started asking him what he was getting out of all of this, and he wouldn't respond. It was so strange and awkward, and I think that's what began to genuinely scare me more than if the calls had been filled with threats or innuendo. It felt like the guy had decided to do this to creep on me and spy on me for some reason, but then had no idea why he wanted to do it when he was actually doing it. I don't know if this makes sense, or maybe I'm just thinking about this after the fact, but I got the impression that these calls weren't his big, creepy plan. It was just something that he felt compelled to do on top of something else he'd done. I decided not to answer the calls for a while and see what would happen. He kept calling, incessantly, to the point that the ringtone just wouldn't stop. And as soon as one call would end, he'd call again, and again, and again. And in the end, it was making me so mad and upset that I answered again. And before he could say anything, I demanded to know how he could see me. And that's when he replied with a line that made my blood run cold. "I'm in the house with you." He even said ha 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 in this very deadpan, monotone voice. Of course, I knew he couldn't actually really be in the house. I would have heard him talking for one thing, and I checked all the closets and corners and possible hiding spots, but it was still absolutely terrifying to hear as some teenage girl home alone. I started trying to think about it as if he was in the house, though. Was there any clues to how he could be watching me? I tried to remember all the different things he'd seen throughout the night, and I realized that everything he saw was either in the living room or in the kitchen doorway. Whichever window he was watching me through had let him see the main living room in almost its entirety, and he'd also commented previously on the fact that I'd almost spilled water as I entered from the kitchen. And this suddenly got me thinking. The idea felt familiar, of there being a view of my living room where the kitchen doorway was visible, and that's when I remembered this was the view from the family's PC webcam. Now remember, this was the late 2010s, and the idea that hackers could watch you through your webcam was fairly new at the time. I ran to the family computer, unplugged the chunky webcam that we had at the time, and suddenly, the calls stopped. This basically confirmed it for me. This creeper had somehow accessed the family's PC webcam and could see me. This made me feel better in a lot of ways. It was probably some internet weirdo who was nowhere near me and had no idea where I actually lived or who I was. And this was somehow a lot better than a possible stalker outside, but still, the idea of a hacker watching me through the family computer made me feel sick. Long story short, a family friend ran this scan for us and discovered that something had been downloaded onto our family PC at some point the week before. We never found out which family member had downloaded this software by accident, but I'm certain it was my dumbass younger brother who was always downloading weird crap at the time. He was 12, and we did actually report the incident to the cops, but this was way back in 2008, like I said, and cybercrime just wasn't even a thing that they looked into much. And plus, I underplayed the situation by not revealing how many times I'd answered the phone and admitting to the fact that I kinda handled the situation in a very unfortunate, morbid sense. And I'm just very grateful that it was only the family living room that hacker could view. The idea of someone being able to spy on me through that laptop in my bedroom made me so paranoid that I just kept tape over my webcams across all devices ever since. I never found out who the weird hacker caller was or confirmed for sure that he was just some internet weirdo who had access to my webcam and managed to connect it to a phone number, but it's the only explanation that let me sleep at night. It's now been nearly 20 years since then, and I still tape over my webcams to this day and make sure my own kids are extremely safety conscious about using the internet because you never know what kind of weirdos are out there. So I'm a girl, and I met guys online in the early 2000s, back when it was still considered risky and dangerous to meet people online. Now let me tell you, it's probably a good thing we considered some online friendships to be inadvisable back then, because there are some major weirdos around, and let me tell you again, and back in the 2000s, they were first discovering computers and what they could do with them. This guy added me on ICQ, an old instant messenger program. ICQ used to have this feature where you could just add a random person, like it would just select another user at random and allow you to message them. And as far as I ever knew, there were no way to see the difference between someone who'd added you by directly typing your username in and someone who'd added you as a random request. So I had a bunch of friends there who I only knew through ICQ, as well as a few IRL school friends who I spoke to through the service. One guy on my friends list, we'll just call Steve, was a pretty cool and funny guy. We didn't really know each other that well, and I had no idea how he came to add me as a friend, and I never really even thought to ask. It wasn't something that really mattered back then. You accumulated a bunch of internet weirdos who were just kind of there in your life, and you didn't really remember how you'd met them. Steve would just send me dumb jokes and memes, and before we even called them memes, and he'd sometimes recommend cool new music for me to download from Napster or LimeWire or whatever weird stuff we were using back then. He was just one of those guys that you meet online who seems cool, funny, and mysterious, and you don't ever let the conversations get too personal because you're both too cool for that. Most people who grew up as a loser, introvert online teen in the 90s and 2000s like me will know exactly what vibe I'm talking about. Or at least, I hope so. Now one day, I was home alone because my parents were out of town. I was in, I think, maybe my junior year of high school, maybe, or the start of senior year. And yeah, it must have been the start of senior year because it was October. And it came as a massive surprise that when, out of the blue, internet friend Steve messaged me saying, "Hey, I'm going to come over tonight because you're home alone." Something along those lines. And as far as I knew, I'd never even discussed which city I lived in with Steve, let alone given him my specific address. And I'd certainly never told him that my parents were out of town. I figured it had to be a joke and a coincidence, so I just replied with "Raffle" or some such, and waited to see what Steve said. Steve replied saying that he was serious and he was going to come over. I scanned back over our conversation to see if I had mentioned being alone over the weekend in passing, and I hadn't. Now, I don't want to screw up my friendship with Steve at this point because I thought he was cool and funny, so I try to play it cool myself and sort of act like I'm going along with the joke. I ask him how he knows my address, but I try and make it seem like I'm kidding around. Hard to do over text, but we had it down to an art form back then. Steve got all serious and said that he's been wanting to tell me for a while, but we actually go to high school together, and he didn't add me randomly. He said that he could tell that I thought that he was just some random guy, but we actually know each other. And this starts to make my hackles rise, but I still assume that he's just joking because this is the kind of prank that we'd play on each other back then. But Steve replies with a bunch of things that he could only know if he knew me in real life. Details about me, my high school, crap like that. And this kind of freaked me out at this point because either Steve was some hacker guy or he really was an IRL acquaintance who just hadn't admitted it until now. Still, he hadn't really done anything wrong though, other than saying that he was coming over, which could still be a joke, so I just asked him about that and he said no, he was serious, because he wanted to talk to me about things face to face. I said no, he shouldn't come over, at least not without telling me who he actually was first. Steve said this was the problem. He didn't want to tell me who he was unless he could do it in person, because he had feelings for me and he was worried that I'd react badly if I knew who he was, so he wanted to explain himself to me in person. And so I asked him why it would be better if he could tell me in person, and he just sort of says, "It just would be," and then refused to clarify any further. So I started getting more and more mad and freaked out at this. I couldn't explain why, but it just felt like he'd led me on somehow. You'd have to have seen our conversations back in the day. He definitely acted like someone who did not know me IRL until that point. It felt deceptive. Besides, I kinda gotten into my head that Steve was Andy IRL, this skater kid from high school who had a crush on me in sophomore year and had been a bit overly persistent with it until I told him to chill out. Andy was the only person that I could think of in real life from high school who might want to or need to explain himself to me face to face about hanging out with me. It also pissed me off that he decided to reveal all this by making it clear that he knew my parents were out of town. It felt like a weird power play, and considering that I hadn't told anyone about my parents going out of town, it was info that had to have been obtained creepily. At least that's what I thought anyway. In my head, my friend Internet Steve had just revealed that he'd been high school Andy this whole time, someone I majorly wasn't attracted to and had rejected previously, and now he wanted to come over and hang out because my parents were out of town. And I'm just like, lol, no. How about we end this here and forget it ever happened? And then I blocked him. It sucked to lose that Internet Steve person as a friend, but then I had to keep reminding myself that he wasn't Internet Steve. He was somebody in real life and probably Andy. And I fully expected that to be the end of it. When my doorbell rang 15 or so minutes later, I didn't even entertain the idea that it could be Steve or Andy. And by the time I got downstairs, though, I had put two and two together and started to freak out. What if Andy was just standing there on my doorstep asking to be let in? He was a big guy. He could easily overpower me if he wanted to. My front door back then was the kind where you could see the vague outline of a person through the frosted glass, or as was the case here, you could see where there wasn't a person at the front door. And so I crept to the peephole and looked out. There was nobody standing there, but I could very clearly see the word bitch spray-painted across my driveway. So Internet Steve really was a local person and was not above making threatening gestures the moment he got rejected. I was very glad that I went with my gut and blocked him, and the next step was doing something about it, though. Now, being a very awkward teen, I realized that I did not want to have to deal with my parents and or the cops over that incident, and I knew that I'd get blamed for giving our home address to strangers no matter how much I tried to explain that Steve had to be a local person. So I just sort of scrubbed the graffiti off of our driveway that weekend before my parents got home and never mentioned it to them. Naive, I know, but I'm still convinced that I saved myself a lot of unnecessary drama. The next stage involved confronting Andy at school. I did this the following Monday, backed up by two friends, and I just walked up to him and demanded to know what he'd been doing on Friday night. About 5 or 6 of his friends all said skate park at once, and Andy just looked at me confused. Apparently, Andy had pulled off some notably epic skating trick at a late-night skating contest at the park on that previous Friday night, and his buddies thought that I'd heard about it and was asking about that. Thankfully, this gave me cover to pretend that this was in fact what I was talking about, instead of having to explain the whole story about the graffiti and Internet Steve. And so I played it off like I was impressed by hearing about Andy's skate trick, and then just sort of skirted away, embarrassed and none the wiser as to who Internet Steve was. Andy himself found me later that day and asked what was really up with my question earlier, and I guess he worked out something was actually bothering me. We weren't friends or anything. He'd been a little pestering when he had a crush on me sophomore year, but I didn't hate the guy or anything. And I just explained to him outright that a guy that I had on my ICQ friends list had threatened me and suggested that he had a previous crush on me. Andy laughed and said it was far from the only person who'd ever had a crush on me, which made me feel like a jerk. But then he was actually really pretty sweet about it and genuinely concerned for my well-being, and said that he'd ask around and see if he could dig up any info or hear any gossip about who Internet Steve might really have been. Unfortunately, Andy never found out, and I think I know why. I've never been able to prove who Internet Steve was, and in some ways I think it's for the best that I never knew, because it would have opened up a huge amount of trouble if it had come out back in the day and I'd confronted this person. You see, I'm 99% sure that Internet Steve was actually my history teacher. It would have explained why he wanted to see me face to face to explain himself, and why he wouldn't tell me who he was online, and why it would have all been super weird. But it's also horrifying to consider that a grown-ass adult, a teacher no less, was talking to a high school girl online, and then when she blocked him, wrote an insult on her driveway in spray paint. Now, that teacher was a younger teacher, must have been in their late 20s, and he and I got along pretty well. Now, I admit that I did have a tiny bit of a crush on him, but I was a teenage girl. It's an adult teacher's job to dismiss that kind of thing, and we'd always been pretty chatty at school, talking about music and movies and books in a sort of cool teacher, loser student type way. But after the incident with Internet Steve, that history teacher started acting very weird with me, extremely distant and cold, and even scolding and snapping at me on a few occasions. It was the only person in my life who acted differently towards me immediately after I blocked Internet Steve, and to this day I am certain that it was him. I do wish that I'd been able to prove it, but it was one of those things that you don't really notice at the time, and it only actually dawned on me at graduation when I really thought things over. I went off to college the next year, and there was nothing I could do to try and prove that that teacher was Internet Steve, so I guess I just have to hope that whoever it was, he never escalated beyond being a weird creeper who threatened girls with graffiti. With someone like that, though, who knows how nuts they can get. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, eggnog is chicken milk.